today's webinar, which will be focusing on the research problem and the solution bias and why it is so hard to let go of old solutions-driven habits. With this, we hope that the learning outcomes are generally for you to get a clearer understanding of research problems and to raise awareness that we live in a solution-based world. And more specifically, to know what constitutes a research problem in the first place, to understand whether the research problem is a start or the end point of your research journey, to reflect on the solution bias and the role of habits, learn about how to keep a problem focus and understand that the solution bias is also in search tools and information, and get a better perception on the difference between problems and research problems, and finally to jointly reflect on the role of guides and different lenses. And then exactly off the records, the recording will stop and we will have a group activity where we reflect on how self-aware are we about possible solution bias in our environment or in ourselves. With this, what constitutes a research problem in the first instance? A research problem is not a solution. That's quite obvious, but unfortunately, a lot of times we are driven by our outcome expectations and therefore rather consider the solution and not the problem dimension of the problem. And an example how that often comes across, the problem is that we need to reduce our high employee fluctuation rates. So we start by saying the problem is, but then we immediately move over to what we need to reduce high employee fluctuation rate. But why are they high in the first instance? That remains unknown if we change the focus immediately. And a research problem is also not a question. Now, if for the left questions, how does divorce influence children's social development, is a good and suitable research question, then what would be the suitable research problem to that? A suitable matching research problem, for example, would be a recent study across the US has shown that the social development of primary school children of divorced parents is 2 years behind the development of children from non-divorced parents. So there is a clear question problem match. And a research problem is also not a title. If, for example, a title is side effects of chemotherapy, then the problem to that would be, for example, patients on chemotherapy and interventions that have been only moderately successful in reducing these effects. Now, the title definitely gives an outline about what the problem is, but it shouldn't be framed as a title. And a research problem. So reviewing the market positioning strategy to understand how nonlinear organization factors affect the effectiveness of the organization and capabilities. This is an example taken from a student work, and it shows that this is clearly not a problem. However, often problem statements are framed like that. And a research problem is also not an opinion. An example of how this error often comes across, we need to write more funding proposals since 9 out of 10 funding proposals do not make it through. We need to get at least 5 proposals funded per year. Therefore, we need to write at least 50 funding proposals. So how can we motivate our scientists to write more funding proposals? This is clearly also not a problem. It's a statement with a presumed answer, but it entirely ignores why 9 out of 10 proposals fail. So again, it's not looking at the research problem. So what are characteristics of a research problem? In a nutshell, it's a situation that is broken. It ideally shows some cause and effect relationships. It has boundaries and can therefore be expressed in short, precise sentences. It's real, and that's very important. It's not something abstract or hypothetical. So we can observe this and there's this evidence for it. And it might be the starting point or the end point of the research. And we will look into this in the next part of the webinar. But first, let's see why defining a research problem can be challenging. Now, there was a very brilliant guy who won the laureate Nobel Prize in Physics, and about him it was said that he had amazing problem-solving abilities. He would write down the problem, he would think very hard, and then he would write down the answer. That sounds simple, right? But let's look at that. why it can be challenging to define a research problem. Now, let's look into the highlighted blue part. As I understand it, think very hard. From his perspective meant imagine the known processes involved as they take place in nature and attempt to ferret out the problem as if the process in question would fit into the known, like a piece in jigsaw puzzle. This is done by taking into consideration system and properties, and there will be many of those. It would probably involve a process of elimination, much as a physician diagnosed disease by ruling out possibilities. So there's a lot of tacit going on, and that tacit in the written part of your thesis obviously would need to be brought out. You would need to write it down. That sounds trivial, but it often is a hard part. I mean, once later on we understand the answer and the question, things are much more obvious. But it is consisting of higher and lower level areas of the problem that interrelate or not, and that need to gradually be worked out. So this is a challenging and gradual process. And it requires the establishment of firm or fluid boundaries. As in this example brought out, I occasionally overlook how important it is to define and bound a problem. So it's really important to gradually work out what are the boundaries, what is within the problem, what is outside. Now, are there any questions to the first part of the webinar? Then let us move into the second. Understanding whether the research problem is the start point or the end point of your research journey. And yes, this is related to deductive and deductive reasoning. If the research problem understanding is relatively clear to you, then the research problem likely constitutes the start point. Contrary, if the problem understanding is very vague, you might need to focus your research on developing this clear understanding. And we will look into this with two concrete examples. The research problem as a start point. Let's take this example. The organization is showing a high fluctuation rate as the leadership team is lacking people management skill. Now, let's look into this further. This is showing a situation that is broke. One can observe a cause and effect relationship, and there's an initial observation and evidence. So in this case, you have a very good understanding what the problem likely will be. And so this is a starting point. And while this starting point might be clear, the reason why the leadership team is lacking people management skills is still unknown. And this is what this research will be focusing on. So it's a very logical next step. We know what is known, we know what is not known, and this is what we will be finding out. However, if the research problem is the end point, we are not in this comfortable situation. We just understand that something isn't as it's supposed to be. And this is an example taken from one of my earlier students, which faced the following situations. She was working as an admission practitioner, and institutions of higher education have a desire to create a diverse student body. So to provide students with a multicultural environment. This will allow for the institution, they will often use race-conscious admission practices. However, this would require to use affirmative action in higher education, but this is in most parts legally not allowed. It would violate federal and state level legislation. So there's something that is desirable. There's a clear mean of how to do it, but there are legal boundaries why this cannot be done. It's a complex situation where I, as an admission officer, am tasked to create a diverse student body, which includes multicultural student population. However, the use of race-conscious admission practices is technically illegal because it violates federal and state level legislation. But in some cases, it has to be allowed. So it's a very complex situation. Now, would you know what a suitable research question is to this? In this case, the student did not, and the research took many different avenues over a couple of years, and finally it reached a point where the problem was understood, and this was the opening statement of the final thesis. Affirmative action in college admission is a continuous topic which has inspired a significant amount of legislation affecting its use. This legislation exists independently at the state and federal level, but when viewed together within the entire legislative framework, individual pieces of legislation contradicting each other, providing confusion and conflicting legal guidance for higher education admission counselors. Admission counselors' daily activities are governed by this law. So at the end of the research journey, it was clearly understood that the reason for the issue to be there was different legislation at the state and federal level that results in contradicting legislation and guidance, and therefore confusing and conflicting legal guidance for admission counselors. So the research question in hindsight was quite obvious. Why are higher education admission counselors provided with confusing and conflicting legal guidance? Now, 4 years earlier, this question could not have been guessed. Let's come into the solution bias and the role of habits. Now, the issue with research problems is that doctoral students often draw on their day-to-day experience and practices, and this leads them to struggle to craft a research problem. And one of the underlying reasons for this is that from early on, we are trained to solve problems. The tinkering, inquiry, exploration that comes with it, each child is gradually educated out. Once we go through the school process, we are trimmed to work towards solutions or to improve something, not even knowing why. So, and many guides that we found at the web are written by advanced researchers who know how science works and therefore often mislead us. We will look into this later. They are biased by target audience also often, which is pitching something to funding agencies. So there are a lot of things that conflict with our development of problem understanding and why we look rather into the solution end. Moreover, solutions are exciting while problems are not. Now, to put it in the words of practitioners, solutions are exciting, especially those you're a part of creating. So implementing a new solution is an intellectual turn on, while focusing on looking at a problem is something hard. It's not rewarding. There is no direct incentive. It's just frankly not as exciting as looking into problems. So the solution bias is very common, and we know a problem, we have seen a certain solution work, and we try to repeat it. It's easier. Likewise, it's quite common that students rush in building a solution. So without even really having the problem understood, we need to do something, and this is what the students then will focus on. Just build the right solution, not look and understanding the problem. And it's not that creating a solution quickly is a bad thing. However, it is when it's the wrong solution. Solution to what? If we don't have an understanding what is the problem, obviously, we also will not know what is the solution. And let me just mute everyone. Okay. So, and this gets even worse once excitement meets opportunities, because then the rush increases. Opportunities are something that need to be now, and this now again will lead to action. But the action then again fuels something to work into the solution end, but not into the problem end. So, how to keep then a problem focus? Well, there's one thing is, if you stay at the dark side, you are safe. Solutions are exciting. They are bright and shiny. It is how you want things to be. From a research perspective, however, the dark side is where things are broken, and you are going to figure out why it's broken. If things only look bright and shiny, then likely you're more on the solution side. If you look into the dark side, you will understand what is broken and over there work towards the solution. Or in other words, the recommended path for filling out a lean canvas is starting with the problem customer segment quadrant. But if you already carry a picture of a hammer in your head, the danger is framing all problems as nails. Instead of brutally forcing your solution, reframed as problems, remember the earlier part of the webinar where the problem is, and then you immediately, therefore we need. So your customer segment by start defining the bigger compelling context for your customers. So check on which side you are. Are you on the dark side, or are things looking bright and shiny? So how to break the old solution-focused habits? There are some ways for us to control us. Focus on context, not the tools. Reflection instead of action. And once you are in action, also reflection in action. Critical analytics instead of beliefs and desires. So what are the facts? What are the evidence pieces? Process focus means what is working how, rather than how do you want things to be. No outcome focus. Questioning over concluding, which is in particular important once you work with the literature. Don't pick up only on the conclusions, but also, and perhaps more even, look into the evidence base and how things have been analyzed. Stakeholder engagement over expert groups, work with those people to whom the problem relates. Plus, do not rush. As said, many doctoral students are quick to try and put things together, including their methods and so, but this is not the right way to go. Research is a very structured process, and you don't need to be creative on the wrong end. Instead, advance gradually over the points that become clear to you, because research is also a gradual process that is not known at the entry point, as has been shown for the complex research problem of one student I had on the legislation. And only at the end point, things are very well understood and clear. So take out your excitement, don't be creative on the wrong side. There's more to it. The solution bias, unfortunately, is also in the search tools and information that we consult on a day-to-day basis. Everyone likely will know Google, and if you look at those 3 search results, you might notice a slight difference in the number of hits that you get. Now, as a novice researcher or outsider, how likely is it for you to think that a solution bias is really something that exists? You only get 8,680 hits. So likely you have been typing in something wrong, right? No. So the other side, a solution business, you got a lot of hits. So you will be quite sure that this is something that exists. But upon closer look, you will find that the search results are strange. Solution business, building a platform for organic growth. Solution business model, how to secure profitability. What does a business solution company do? Aha. Are solutions becoming a problem for your business branch? Solution business, a market. So none of the solutions that Google provides us with at the end of the day really does make sense. And the solution business, despite having generated a lot of hits, is not really adding up that much. So we are framed by solutions in an apparent solutions-driven world, in a world where confusing terms such as solution business are 394 times more indexed by Google than a well-vested term like solution bias. So there's not much support and help that we can expect from information technology if we are not really sure and know what we are looking for. So this is a knowledge and understanding that we need to develop. And since we are there, a note on problems and research problems. Not all problems that we face are research problems. There's a difference in between a problem as such and a problem to you or to me. While the problem to you might bother you, it might not qualify as a research problem. So what is the difference in here? Now, if my company goes bankrupt, then this is my problem, but it is not a problem as such. The economic system was designed for bankruptcy to happen. So if I'm doing something badly, I'm a bad manager, or the economic conditions are getting worse, the company will not survive. But that's perfectly fine, because the economic system was exactly designed for that. It's just a problem to me, but it's not a research problem as such. Now, if we look, however, into the right side of the image, we will see the word fraud. And this is something that the economic system was not designed for. So if a bankruptcy is taking place because of fraud, the situation changes. In this case, we have a research problem because the system was not built for fraud to occur. Rather, the opposite side, there's an entire legislation to prevent fraud. So there's a difference in between problem as such, which is not a research problem, and research problems once things are not like they meant to be, if that is making sense. Coming to the role of guides and the different lenses that we might use to interpret these. There are many guides that talk about goals, desired states, value, vision, and they are often geared by exploring solutions to problems. It's again the solution versus the problem, which also means the lens that we adopt will very much decide about how we read things. There might be, in the right side, you see from Emerald, a guide to problem solving. There might be very well intended literature and guides out there in order to help us to understand how to work towards the problem solving process. However, if our focus and reading lens is on the word solving rather than on the word problem, that will determine on how we read those guides. The point is that those guides are often known by scientists and they know how science works, and that all positives will only be the result of having examined the problem first. So we first need to understand what is a problem, what are the parts of it, how are the research questions to the problem, how do different problems dimension relate to each other, and over there we can work towards the solution at. And accordingly, once we read guides, we also need to understand what words such as problem solving imply. They imply we first look into the problems and then analyze the situation, determine the real problem, look at every possible, again, a dangerous word, solution, evaluate each of the solutions and choose the best one for the purposes. So as you can see, if you're having a solution-driven way of reading this guide, you will exactly focus on possible solution and evaluate each solution, but you don't really understand that this only means you first get a very deep problem understanding and only then understand which type of solutions are out there and could work. Many resources on problematizing and problem statements suggest, unfortunately, things that you simply don't know. As seen at the earlier example of the admission case, the knowledge only builds up over time. So, however, guides and guidances are written assuming that you know everything at a given point in time. So how can you tell about the significance or the background of an issue if you still haven't fully identified what the issue is? While chapter 1 introduction comes first, it can only be finalized by the time chapter 6 conclusion has been concluded. And likewise, the literature review chapter comes before the data and findings chapter. However, only once the data emerges and the findings come out, you really will have a clear understanding about what the relevant literature is. So it's not a linear process, but a way more front and back juggling. If you want to advance your understanding, check out our advanced training course on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing. That comes in 3 formats: free self-study with peer support, fully tutored, or flexible on-demand feedback, and it will provide you with a better idea on how to work gradually out the research problem and derive research questions from there. With this, let me go off the record and open the floor for any questions and discussions that you might have.